I wanted to go ahead and introduce our subject matter experts. So we have our creative director here at Mighty Citizen and our subject matter expert on brand, Gardner Roderick.
Hi,
And
everyone.
and we also have Michelle Stickle, who, as I mentioned, is with the National Association of Pediatric Nurse Practitioners. I can't thank you enough for taking time out of your schedules to be with us today. But I am going to ask each of you, can you give us just a couple of details on your background, just for the audience's sake? So Gardner, I'm going to let you go first.
Sure. My background is in strategic creative communications. So I've been doing this work for about 18 years in kind of a multidisciplinary capacity, working in messaging and brand and advertising, and have a bunch of industry experience across associations and higher ed, healthcare, some tech, and some B2B, B2C.
Okay. And Michelle, can you give us some insight into you?
Sure. So I've been working in marketing, communications, and strategy for more than 25 years, sort of dating myself like Nicole. First, I worked in the legal sector on some very large scale litigation that was tried throughout the country. Then I decided that I would move into the nonprofit sector about 10 or 15 years ago. And so I think that it's really been an amazing change here in marketing communications over the last decade with the evolution of technology. I'm finding that my work has become much more evidence-based and data-driven, so that, using wonderful consultants like Mighty Citizen and all kinds of software tools that are out there have definitely changed the environment.
I love those two terms, evidence-based, basing it on data. That's awesome. So we brought you here today. Gardner, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. I mentioned that you did a session last week at ASAE's Membership and Marketing Conference on the fundamentals of communicating the value of brand to your board. And for those that missed that session, can you give us just the top takeaways from that session so we can kick off this branding discussion?
Sure. Well, for anyone who might be facing any kind of brand dilemma, or you might be thinking about tackling a brand problem, we often know that the board is kind of intertwined with being able to proceed on some of these initiatives. And so we wanted to make sure that we started to build a vocabulary of how to engage the board so that you could really find success in these projects. And there's some general takeaways here. There's really kind of 4 of them. The first one is to always be educating whenever you can your board about the difference between brand and branding. We like to think of them very differently, just to enable us to have really operational conversations about what we're doing. So a brand, in our perspective, is your organization's reputation. It is the thing you kind of can't actually touch, right? It's the thing that people are making up in their minds and their hearts. It's intangible. Branding is all of that work that you're doing day in and day out as communicators to try to influence that perception. So that's one of the takeaways. The next is to make sure that marketing is a priority for your board. Marketers, communicators, they are responsible for a lot of the brand management that's occurring in your organization. And it's important to surface all of that work to the board, and so that they understand how critically connected, member outcomes are to the work that you're doing. And so the next piece here is to bring some kind of marketing awareness or expertise into the composition of your board. You really want to take advantage of the fact that you have an opportunity to select who will be on your board. And you want someone kind of advocating for you on your behalf when these big initiatives come up. You want there to be someone there that can say, hey, this work is really important, or this idea is really important, and really start to build consensus at that level when you're not around. Mm-hmm. And the last bit here is something that Michelle just touched on, which is only bring rebrands to the board in terms of a project that you want to tackle or what have you, or any kind of brand discussion, when unbiased data shows that it's time. So you want research to inform all of your branding activity. You don't want to just use a hunch and make a change. Rebrands really aren't, they're only necessary in a few situations, whether there's a change in your mission, or there's a merger with another organization, or there might be a crisis or a scandal that you're trying to avoid. So there's some very, very few instances where a full rebrand is needed. Oftentimes you can find that research will yield a different approach to tackling a brand problem than a giant exercise of redoing a brand. So those are really kind of some 4 quick takeaways to keep in mind as you're approaching brand work and brand work that is successfully done through your board.
And Jill, I saw that Brianna actually posted the link in the chat for the full session in its entirety. But Gardner, what a great transition to Michelle. I'm going to put you right on the spot. Again, thank you so much for being with us and being willing to speak candidly and answer questions about the process you went through for your rebrand. But can you give us an overview of the process, the landscape, what made you decide to do this? How did you know it was the right time? And I am going to go ahead and share my screen so that we can see the old brand for the group here.
Sure. So the National Association of Pediatric Nurse Practitioners is the oldest nurse practitioner society in the world. We were established back in 1973. And I've been with the organization for about 10 years and responsible for marketing and communications for the last 3 or so. And it just became a lot more evident that our brand may need a little bit of a refresh or an assessment at least, because it had not been touched from whatever recollection and files that we could recreate for at least 20 years. And so it's definitely looking a little out of date. But back to that data-driven idea, we actually have seen the number of nurse practitioners grow in the United States extensively and exponentially over the last 5 to 10 years, especially. And there's a growing number of different types of nurse practitioners. So we really wanted to get a sense of how is our brand and our particular role in the nurse practitioner community, how is that perceived? What is our value? Do people even know about us? That type of thing. So we had made a change in our bylaws to be more inclusive to different types of pediatric focused nurse practitioners, but we really weren't seeing increasing numbers of family nurse practitioners, for example. And so it was definitely an idea that we needed to think about how does our brand play in here and what can we do to, again, assess or perhaps revamp the brand to make ourselves more attractive to the growing community. And so part of the issue, our name was a very large piece of our logo that was out there. Pediatric nurse practitioners stood out. So when I was at conferences talking to potential members, people would look at the giant sign behind me in the booth and say, well, I'm not a PNP, and so it's a longer explanation of explaining we're open to everybody, because honestly, that mark that you're seeing there doesn't imply that. So those are all types of things that were sort of on our mind when we thought about the branding project and kind of entering into this long-term project.
Great.
Yes, and I'll jump in here to add that, part of so many associations' work is managing all the different kind of satellites or affiliates. Sometimes they're just chapters. And over time, those distinct chapters can start building their own identities. And it's actually a sign of a really positive sign of growth and for there to be a lot of interest in the organization. And you want to foster that in a way where the parent organization is still being a mentor to those chapters. And so what we noticed right away is that you can see here on this slide is that over time, there had been a fracturing of the identity here, where some of the chapters were creating their own identities. Some of the products that were coming out of the organization were creating their own identities. And so as Michelle entered into this idea, well, where is our membership now? Where is the industry heading? It was also a good time to kind of circle back and look at the entire ecosystem to say, okay, how can we refine all of this and streamline it?
Mm-hmm.
Definitely.
All right, well, we're going to show you where they landed with the new brand here. Can you guys explain a little bit about the research that went into this new brand and the recommendations? What did it tell you and what you were surprised by?
So it was definitely an interesting process where Mighty Assistant took the lead on research. We shared a lot of information that we had from our association over the last 2 or 3 years prior to the branding exercise start. And so I'll let Gardner speak to that. But I think that the thing that I was unsure about and ultimately was surprised about was really our name. I wondered if the full name of the organization was holding us back. And as I mentioned earlier, especially in that particular logo that you saw.
Yeah, and I'll say that, a takeaway for any of the folks on the webinar here is that Michelle came to us with a very deep bag of research already conducted over the course of, the entire organization's existence, but also relatively recent research that was only 3 or 4 years old, I believe. And that's very, very valuable. So you want to constantly be doing research and constantly be touching your members or following up with your members about how you're doing. Because if you're going to enter into any kind of initiative later on, that is the kind of information that will dictate the types of investments you should make and the types of changes that you need to make. So that was the first step. So getting to dive deep into the organization gave us all the information we needed to structure our workshops, to identify the types of people that we needed to speak to, who would be the right people to have inside of the room in a brand workshop. Did we need leadership? Did we need, the boots on the ground folks? Did we need someone from chapters, et cetera? We were able to gauge the type of participation that had already been kind of occurring and who was going to be really good, productive participants leading into this brand exercise. And so the next piece about having this access to all this information is then we get to fill in the gaps. So we want to make sure always that our research that we conduct for brands or for brand exercises is project specific. So sometimes an organization will say, oh, we do so much research, but sometimes that research is very mission centric or it's very product centric, et cetera. And that is great, but entering into a rebrand, there's a whole different type of qualitative analysis that you need to do. And we can, by seeing that old research, we can find those gaps and then structure new research that's going to directly inform and bring consensus into the types of steps we would take to redo the brand. So in this particular instance, the name was something we wanted to tackle because, like many of you and your associations, the acronym starts to become the status quo and how people refer to themselves and how people communicate outwardly and externally. But if we really put on our hats of the new, the young new member who has never been touched before, we want to make sure that there's a lot of context around those acronyms. And so this was our hunch. Do we have the full name and the identity or don't we? Let's ask how people perceive NAPNAP as an acronym versus the full name, and if there's any kind of aversion there. And then, like what Michelle alluded to, we have a strategic goal behind all of this work, which is how do we open up our audience a little bit more to let those FNPs come into the fold. So we use that hypothesis to structure all our research, and then we conduct the surveys, then we do the analysis, and then we come together as a group and decide, okay, based off of what we've heard, we're going to make this decision about the name, we're going to do this decision about iconography, and even other kind of tangential branding assets, like things about questions about taglines or messaging, were also really helped by all of this research.
Great. So I'm going to move to the next slide here to talk about these logo lockups. Can you give us some insight onto that a little bit, Gardner?
Sure. And I'm just looking left here because my other screen has everything else. So these lockups are a standard process for any branding agency. So if you are in talks with anyone, this is sort of the deliverable that you should get back when you're considering a website redesign, which is something that will structure both how the mark looks in a horizontal placement and a vertical placement, and then also how it can live in a standalone, concise way, because like what Michelle was saying, the world has changed and your identity needs to live and operate and exist in a whole bunch of different facets that you aren't always going to know beforehand that you're going to need. So it's on us as experts in design or what have you to be able to build you an identity that can kind of shrink down and shrink up. And so with these particular lockups, you're seeing how we really wanted there to be some kind of iconographic mark, like the shield silhouette, that could work for social media, or could work for a small, if people are aware of what a favicon is, that little mark that's up in the corner of a browser tab, things like that. We're always thinking of simplicity and how to be able to infuse a lot of meaning into that simplicity. So when we make all those decisions, they come together in sort of this elegant way. But you can see here how the full name is treated quite well here. We were originally we were like, well, it's a pretty long name, but if you give it its space and you really consider the proportions of the typography and how it pairs with that simple identity, you can get a very elegant looking piece of communication, even if you have a wordy association name.
All right. Well, Michelle, I'm going to put you on the spot for a moment here. I'm really curious what part of the rebranding process was most challenging for you?
Well, so we started working with Gardner and team remotely through that research back in January of 2020. And we had our workshop, I believe it was maybe the first week of February of 2020. And then something really crazy happened in the world. And so we basically were at the beginning of our branding process as the pandemic, hit America. And it was also about 10 days, all this, the pandemic's arrival here. It was also about 10 days before our national conference, which is our largest money-making event of the year. So we were in the process of trying to do this rebranding project, but we're also canceling our in-person conference in California and transitioning that to a virtual conference, not just a Zoom on steroids, but an actual platform with exhibit hall and all those good features to it. So it was just the most crazy time for us. And ultimately, luckily, it was a very successful year for us, but it was definitely pretty crazy there. We also, because of the pandemic and knowing that we were doing this huge cancellation of our biggest in-person event, financially, we were highly concerned about spending any money, and whether there was a question of whether we should pull out of the branding. And at the same time, we were also beginning a website redevelopment project. So should we put the pause button here on these projects, or should we move forward? Ultimately, we decided that we were invested, in the projects far enough along that we needed to keep marching forward. And honestly, it all came down to having a champion on our board who was willing to stand up for the projects, so that we could keep moving them forward at the beginning of the pandemic.
We have a lot of questions about boards, so I'm going to dig into that a little bit later. But Lindsay Curry is actually asking a question in the chat right now. I'm going to put you, I'm going to see what you say here, but she's curious, was there any considerations of a name change as part of this brand, or was that completely off the table?
That's a really great question. And honestly, I would have been open for everything, because I really wanted this outside expertise, because as many of you know, when an outsider says something, it's much better to your board than when you say it. So I was definitely up for anything that anywhere the data would lead us. Ultimately, though, our executive director and the board really didn't want to take it that far, but Gardner and team actually did prepare information for us of what the name change effort would look like, what kind of research would be involved in that, should we wanted to move forward on that. So we did some additional analysis of the membership through a survey just to get a sense of acronym versus full name, but we never took that next step to be a completely different name change, although I think Gardner and his colleagues actually had started thinking a little bit in that direction just in case, but we didn't take it that far.
Yeah, and I'll just a little bit more color there is if we had seen a critical need for a entire renaming, I think, Michelle, we would have pushed you more for that. But because we saw the research coming back, and reminder here that there's a lot of equity in the NAPNAP brand. Nurse practitioners in general are very, very, very passionate people. And this group in particular, they're kind of just a really, scrappy's the wrong word, but that enthusiasm is right on the money. And I feel like when you have that power as an organization, you want to tread very carefully about things like rebrands or renaming. And so we saw in the research pretty quickly that people really had an affinity for the organization as a whole. And it was really just about making some clarifying moves to be able to amplify more of that power.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm going to get to some of these board questions, and I think that we have extra board questions, but there's specific to the NAPNAP rebrand here. Did you have buy-in from the board, and how did you overcome any resistance?
So we actually, had a buy-in from the board before we entered the contract to do this project, and that was via budgetary approval. So this was definitely listed as a special expenditure and board approval of that. And then, we definitely had the board, we talked about it at board meetings and whatnot, and trying to keep board members in the loop at a very high level. We didn't want to get them too far in the weeds, especially in the early on days, because we find sometimes that people on the outside, they get married to a certain idea and they have a hard time seeing all different types of perspectives. So we were keeping that conversation at the higher level. But I'll be honest, there's some board members who felt they were a little too far out of the loop, who felt as though they were elected by the membership and therefore they speak for the membership. And that might be true sometimes, but I still think that, we had to really stand up to make sure that we had a much more representative group on our work group or committee that Gardner and team worked with us. So I think that was really key. And it was good to have, again, I mentioned the champion on the board so that person could help overcome some of the resistance. And sometimes that was personal calls from her to other board members when she got a sense in board meetings that people were getting a little bit upset or little tempers here and there. She could call them and let them express their concerns and help walk them through it. And we had some private conversations with people when we needed to.
Mm-hmm.
And we do a lot of that kind of foundational consensus building work at the outset of projects. We try to become very transparent about the types of voices that we need to create a successful rebrand. You all know that the responsibility of being on the board is great. And there's a lot of things that are happening in their world and a lot of things that they are sort of, in their own worlds too, because they're often either volunteers or what have you, there's lots of other responsibilities they have. And so they want things to be quick and they want to just kind of solve problems very quickly. They're kind of D personalities most of the time. But it's really important for us as an agency or a partner to say, hey, you might have been living in this world for a very long time. You might not know what you don't know about this problem or this project. And so very early on, we will start talking about the idea of listening to membership, bringing membership in, maybe people outside of membership, prospective members, and having those conversations with those folks or bringing them into the fold. It's important to remember that you might have very, very active supporters and very, very, very vocal detractors. And you don't want to kind of, you want to listen to both, but there's probably a majority in the middle that is more silent than and you want to find out what they're thinking about you and about the brand. And so the earlier you can start introducing that idea, the better it's going to go, because you're going to understand, everyone's going to understand the perspective that they're bringing and the open mind that they need to have when entering these projects. It's never black and white. There's a gray there that needs to be addressed.
And if I can add one other piece, Gardner and team were very clear on you can't have too many cooks in the kitchen. So we had to keep our work group nimble and whatnot. So and I have to represent 53 chapters, 18 special interest groups, acute care versus primary care, clinicians, faculty members, researchers, and authors. So NAPNAP members wear a lot of different hats. And so I looked for people that represented, one person might represent 2 or 3 of those categories and whatnot. So we could keep our group small. And then when I did get some feedback from the board about, well, I'm not being represented, I could say, well, so-and-so represents the FMP community, or so-and-so is representing chapter leadership. So I had it all on paper. I love a good Excel matrix. And so I had everything on paper. So when questioned, I could say how all the different groups were represented by a couple of members in the work group. So that was really important to our leadership.
Yeah.
It's tedious work, but it's so valuable. It really is the blueprint that you're building and what you can point to later and saying, see, we heard it from the source. We say a lot at Mighty Citizen, research kills opinions, and it is true.
It definitely is. And I will just convey, I had the pleasure of joining in on that brand workshop in February before the pandemic hit. And you do have just an amazing set of individuals who are very passionate about where the organization is going and certainly what they're doing in their daily lives to support the world. So it was a pleasure to meet them and to see how passionate they were about it. So it was great. Well, you mentioned a very important word, Michelle, and that's the word called chapters. So we're going to move into that for a second. So can you talk a little bit about getting your chapters involved and how you got them excited about the rebrand? And I am showing the screen of the chapter iteration, so we can kind of talk to that a little bit.
Great. Well, thank you. So NAPNAP, about 8 or 9 years ago, we actually unified our chapters under the national umbrella. So some of those chapters had been around with not a lot of national input for decades before they came into the umbrella. So they all had their own identity. And I think Gardner showed some of that earlier, and some of it was good, some of it was not so good. And all of our chapters are volunteer managed. They do not have staff. So that also presents, some challenges here and there. So it was interesting. I did some research to see how other national organizations handled their chapters. And figured out sort of this enterprise versus chapter level and syncing up the brand and whatnot. So our chapters are all their own business entities, their own C6s. They do have a charter with national that does require them to follow certain guidelines. And our guidelines are kind of broad. We want to let the chapters, feel like they're running themselves, which is great. But we definitely realized that we needed to all be on the same brand, thanks to Gardner and team, making sure that we understood that fully. And he was absolutely right. So, luckily we had to work sort of very carefully to establish good relationships with those chapter leaders and to get them to want to come to the new brand versus forcing it on them. I mean, technically we could have forced them, but we didn't want to have to do it that way.
Yeah, and that goes back to the idea of, well, how do you begin the conversation of a rebrand with your chapters? How do you, which really is a conversation like, how do you roll it out? And some folks on the webinar might remember as far back as when Gap, the retailer, redid their brand and just the chaos that ensued from that. So that was a learning moment for many people in the industry to just say, hey, this is a collaborative process. And the more input you have or exposure or transparency you have to the fact that the process is happening, the smoother everything will go. And we made that sort of a critical milestone for Michelle and team to understand that there are going to be points during this process where you're going to check in externally with your group and say, hey, this is coming and it's coming for these reasons. We're excited. We'll keep you in the loop. And I think, again, the idea of having a very active and involved person from the board, Michelle's board president is just spectacular and really took the reins of wanting to communicate and be the lead and the face of this initiative. The idea of leadership behind this is 50% of the success of a rebrand. And so that was fantastic for trickling that message down to the chapters. And then I'll say the last bit here is to remember who the chapters are. They're in the same way that a website can be your first kind of private touch with an organization. You're on your own, going to their website and kind of getting the sense for the feel of that organization. Chapters are your first in-person touch, your first real experience with the organization oftentimes. And we need to be able to equip them to be a mirror or an echo of the parent organization. So anything we can do to make that job easier for them or frame the work that we're doing as making their jobs easier is going to be a win. That experience that they have, your prospective members and your existing members that they have with chapters is that stress test of your brand. So if has your branding come from a place of being holistic, being able to equip the lowest folks on the rung to be successful, that's kind of how you want to approach branding in general. How can it trickle down? How can you see every single kind of granular piece and it always be echoing your strategic goals, and kind of carving people towards just the outcomes that you want them to have as members. I can talk forever about this, but
and I'm actually going to push you to
yeah.
ask.
Okay. The last thing I'll say is that as people who run associations, you are making good on a promise that someone has made before they ever heard about you. Whether they, in my particular case, I wanted to be a designer in high school, and I made that decision really early. When I became a professional, there was an organization to do that. They needed to prove why it was still a good idea to be a designer. You already have affinity because someone has decided to do this passionate thing. It's up to your chapters and up to the parent organization to follow suit.
Mm-hmm.
And so to the tactical of getting those chapters on board, we've had excellent recommendations from Mighty Citizens. So we followed this. We had multiple meetings, sort of the teaser meeting, the rollout meeting. We took the guidelines, we made a special chapters version. We built all the logos for all 53 chapters in different color variations and file types and whatnot. So basically just hand delivered a package of material to our chapter leadership about 10 or 15 days before launch. So that it was still sort of a surprise, but yet they had time to do what they needed to do to get their chapter websites or social media up and running on launch day, September 17th. And just were there for them to answer any questions. So again, sort of getting them on board during the process, just some like teaser meetings and informational meetings, and then preparing that package for them was really key.
This is a question from the group here. Can you tell us, Michelle, if your events are also branded around this new logo and brand, or are they standalone brands?
So our national conference, we do not brand separately. Years and years ago, we used to brand it, and I think Gardner showed you a picture of sort of a California sunrise or sunset, a la surfers. But we stopped doing that. We stopped doing a special location specific brand. We definitely use location specific imagery in our marketing materials and our prospectus and program book things and whatnot. But we try to really stick to the new brand that was produced. Now we do have some additional events with our sub brand Team Peds. So we have town halls, we have Team Peds town halls, Team Peds talks, Team Peds experts live, and those are Facebook events, town halls, or podcasts. So we do have a sub brand, and again the logo though is specifically tied to the new brand as well. So.
Great. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can all see each other's faces a little bit better. Michelle, I'm curious, after going through the rebrand, and all the obstacles, from the timing to leadership changes, challenges of, getting everything rolled out, what do you think are the real key factors to success in a brand?
I really think, having a champion is obviously very important on the board. Having, staff that are very fluid and flexible is also key, but it really goes down to, having great project management and milestone markers and whatnot, and ongoing communication with your consultants. We definitely look to the Mighty Citizen team throughout the whole process. And again, we were doing branding and a brand new website at the same time. So that project management aspect was really, really important. Being on time, on budget, very, very key to us.
Okay. And, I'm curious, what's next? Now that you have the rebrand done and you have this, what's your next step?
Well, we're going to Disney World.
All right.
Actually, we are in Orlando for our next in-person event. So we are going to Disney World. So it's interesting. I mentioned that, we launched some new products under our Team Peds brand. It's really just continuing to keep everyone on board, making sure that nobody strays off of our message. It's figuring out our new products and services and our new members and how we can best serve them, and how that branding and our hero message and whatnot tie into those relationships and products.
So this is a very interesting question. This came from the crowd today, but do you have enough information and feedback to know the ROI and the qualitative value of this branding effort?
Well, we've definitely seen increases in social media engagement, in website traffic, our membership number. Even during COVID, our members, we got 1,600 new members last year. And for our association of only a little over 8,000, and that's a good number. So we have definitely seen some return on our investment. We don't maybe have exactly all the specific numbers that we're looking for quite yet. We haven't even been out a year, but we're definitely keeping an eye on those things.
Mm-hmm. Gardner, when you're working with a team like this, how do you guys decide what data to collect for future to prove that ROI?
Well, we obviously on launch want to see what kind of qualitative responses we get back through whatever kind of channels we've decided to communicate through. So, if we're launching through a Facebook Live, we want to see how many people attended. We want to see what kind of comments we're getting, things that aren't quite, one-to-ones, things that require a little bit of analysis. But overall, we want to gauge a temperature that is positive. And over time, kind of like what Michelle was saying, we'll start to see healthy adoption of the materials that we've produced, actual use of the materials that we've produced. We sometimes talk about brand consistency being kind of the marker for success, but what we're really looking for is for there to be active adoption and to want to use it and to want to iterate on it. And for, again, going back to chapters, them creating new pieces of collateral and new pieces of what have you, and using the new brand. So that adoption is something that we would track and we would see that is being used as it should, downloads of brand guidelines, downloads of however it is that you are distributing the new work, how much do people want to use it is often a good indicator of its success.
Great. All right, we're going to kind of go into just the question and answers, or the question section from pre-submitted questions, because we have quite a few of those. We have handled some of the live questions already. We're going to get through as many as we can. Just as a reminder, our team is going to put together written answers for all the questions, and we will submit them to you to make sure that you get it. And of course, if there's questions beyond that, you can always reach out to us individually. So this one came from Gwen at PJAC. Thank you so much for dropping by, Gwen. How did you share rebrand options with stakeholders, and what do you wish you did differently?
So we sort of had our work group, and then we had our board members. So we would share materials that came through Mighty Citizen to the work group and staff, just to sort of get a fresh quick perspective. And then when it came to board members, we narrowed it down to 2 choices and then presented those to the board members in anonymous survey fashion, so that they could be very honest with their love or their hate for something. Mm-hmm. And just kind of kept it pretty simple. As far as what we would do differently, I'm not quite sure. I think that perhaps, maybe doing some additional calls when necessary might have been helpful. But I think giving people choices and not too many choices was key, because too many choices would just take us down a crazy road.
Mm-hmm. And I'll say that our process involves trying to strip away a lot of subjectivity that is a part of this process, which is why we start with just words. And that workshop, a lot of that workshop's job is to just identify qualities that we want this thing to exude or have. And once we identify those, the way that we share options or talk about options has a really nice connection to things that have already been agreed to. So we all come to a consensus or a way to talk about the options from a familiar place. So we're always trying to do that every step of the way, add a little bit more subjectivity at a time, and see what we ultimately get.
Okay, this one is from Terza at the American Society of Civil Engineers. How important is it to integrate DEI into your brand?
Today, it's more important than ever. I would say it is foundational to integrating it into your brand. It is the key to innovation. It is the key to being an organization that promotes thought leadership. So if you're not talking about this or not trying to figure out how to weave these conversations into your brand from a strategic point of view, lip service is not what we want. We want it to be a foundational aspect for why it is your organization exists.
All right, thank you for that. This is from Renee, and I'm going to ask these two together because they're kind of together. But Renee at the Society for Research and Child Development, how do you ensure not to overwhelm your board with a lot of changes at once?
So, we were doing this branding and the website at the same time, but I was very methodical on information that I would share at each board meeting. Board meets once a month. And so we would pull out pieces that were the most important things either to share with them or to get their opinion on. Again, limiting the choices to ones that we knew we could live with, not making it so overwhelming to them. I think that was definitely key. And then, I have to say, our board was ready for change. We have a lot of new members on, a lot of members representing newer nurse practitioners. And so we were very lucky that way. Having been with the association for 10 years, I remember some past boards were not as innovative or interested in change. So I think our board just happened to be the right time, right place at the right time.
Good. Good. On that same line of board engagement, how do you get them engaged if they're just too busy?
That's a good one. I'll tackle that. Yeah, I'll tackle that one. The quick answer, but the hardest answer is to just start now. And I know that sounds weird, but in terms of sort of those takeaways we talked about earlier, is make your presence known, make your work known, so that it becomes sort of a habit of discussion and it doesn't come out of left field that all of a sudden this new initiative needs to happen. So if there is a steady stream of understanding how marketing work or brand work is fundamental to achieving your organizational goals, your board should be acclimated to wanting to talk about these things and understand why they might need tweaks or overhauls or changes over time. The other approach is to have this methodical kind of roundtable where you really need to discuss the process, how it's going to go, what they should expect. Like Michelle touched on earlier, project management and showing that is a critical component of success will go a long way with your board. A lot of times brand exercises feel kind of nebulous and what are we really accomplishing, and to have those milestones set and deadlines agreed upon really builds a lot of confidence into the seriousness of the project.
All right, this is a big one. So this is from Heidi at Alpha Omega Dental Society. What if your brand has always been defined by a specific idea and it needs to move in a different direction to thrive? I feel like I see your gears going.
It's a really big question.
It's a big question, right?
The first thing to understand is that, again, the brand is in the mind of someone, right? It is just their perception of you. And that person is fielding millions of different things, messages, ideas every single day. And the way they think about you will filter through all of the changes in society and the zeitgeist that particular person is going through. So it's important that you understand that the fundamental idea of your organization shouldn't change through a rebrand. If that's happening, you're becoming someone else or something completely different. In the case of NAPNAP, if we'd changed their name, their mission would not have changed. The thing that they do would not have changed. The value that they bring to members would not have changed. And that is the essence. That is the authenticity. So I wouldn't worry about losing yourself through a rebrand. If it's done correctly, that essence of why it is that you exist should remain and persist. And instead, what you do is you kind of turn it up to 11, right? And you want that identity or that idea to reverberate even more. So it's kind of an interesting question. I mean, sometimes depending on what it is, sometimes a new line of business will come out and it's like, oh, well, we need to completely change who we are. And if that's the case, that is the case. But oftentimes, if it's just your gut saying, well, we're thought of like this, going all in on that might be the solution versus thinking about changing what that idea was.
Yeah,
And
it's
for,
harder to change the masses, right?
I was just going to add, for us, I mentioned earlier, like the giant pediatric nurse practitioners were just staring you in the face, and that's always who we'll be. That's where we were founded. But the team, as we were doing this process and research and kind of interviews with folks, it just really became apparent that we needed to be more inclusive, and we need to sort of stop thinking about the actual person, but really the fact that we are all children, experts in pediatrics and advocates for children. And that became our hero message. It was a way to bring a bigger community of pediatric focused APRNs together. And so, yes, we sort of started focusing more on the expertise and advocacy versus specifically pediatric nurse practitioners. And it was a subtle change, but it really did make a huge difference to us.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that, because tying that in, after going through the rebranding, not doing a name change, you still have pediatric in your name itself, but your hero message extends it for the rest of it. So thank you for sharing that with us. Okay, Gardner, is it okay for a board member's employee to redesign our logo instead of the team itself?
I mean, it depends, like everything.
I think we all have to navigate different scenarios at different times in our lives.
Correct. I mean, obviously, that is a very unique situation where we would tread very carefully on, why we would entertain that idea versus we wouldn't. But as a design professional, right away, I'll go, well, is that person trained? Do they understand the fundamentals of branding? Do they understand, all the different capacities with which a brand needs to operate? Do they understand branding more than just a logo, more than just a logo, if that makes sense? So my gut answer is to never say kind of no to anything right away. What if that person has an incredible skill set? You just never know. And we know that so many associations and nonprofits, they don't have huge budgets to spend on big branding agencies. And so you want to be resourceful if you can. But I would suggest, from a professional opinion, to make sure that there is a professional opinion somewhere in a rebrand exercise that you're doing, even if it's just a consultative approach or what have you.
Well, I think that goes alongside of, making sure that you've vetted all of your ideas and that you're moving forward in the right direction for the organization, that you've done that research to understand it.
I've been doing this for 25 years, and I still learn stuff during that process, and stuff that I'm now taking with me. And so I should get a master's degree or something from Mighty Citizen. But I definitely think that having an outside expert is so key. And again, it just, when a board hears it from an outside expert, it just has a lot more power behind it. And so other members of the board might be more appreciative of a truly outside opinion.
Yep. How about when your logo mark and logo type is part of your logo, what is the best practice in using the logo mark independently?
Oh, that's a great question. This is where really good designers will help you navigate when something becomes what I would call maybe a brand asset versus your actual complete lockup identity is what we call it. So some of those, the horizontal and vertical things that we looked at earlier, those were our lockups. When it's important that a very succinct, condensed appearance of the brand exist, we want all of those pieces to be there. So say you're sponsoring a marathon or something. You want all of that there. This is what we've all decided is the essence of your identity. But pulling that apart is under your control. And what you decide is what goes into those branding guidelines and branding style guides and all the work that we do to say, hey, this is the best way to use this, and this is not how you would use this, and this is where this would appear, et cetera, et cetera. We often use the logo mark for supporting pieces of collateral, like in the background, for adding a little bit of that texture to imagery. We want something to kind of resonate but not be a full picture, right? Or introduce something that's too busy. So being able to pull pieces apart of your visual identity is a really great way to make ties to that core identity. And it's something that's very common in the space, but you do want to set rules around it. So it's funny because we create guidelines all the time, but organizations sometimes forget that they are in control of their guidelines as well. So if you see things changing, or you see that you need a new something because you keep running into this issue, it's okay for you to say, hey, okay, we're going to create rules around how we now use it this way, introduce that as a guideline, and roll it out to the masses.
Mm-hmm.
We actually have used that shield that was a part of our mark, and we separated it from the text. So we've used the shield in a few ways. We've actually make an embossed type of look to that is part of our association's template, PowerPoint template that we use for when we're giving presentations, or even when our during our conference, there's a speaker template or whatnot. So we have the embossed look of our shield. We also use the shield exclusively on socks that we had created because this year we ended up having another virtual event. Our in-person event had to be canceled in March again this year. So it was strictly with the virtual side of the hybrid. And so we wanted everybody to get, usually we get a bag or something. So we actually shipped out socks that were insanely popular. I was trying to find a quick picture to show, but I couldn't. But so we have used the shield selectively in a few cases, but I'm super careful to stick to the guidelines because they do make sense. And when you have 53 chapters and 18 special interest groups, and everybody feels like they want to do something special, you really have to make sure that you're trying to keep everybody on the same page. So I limit the special cases as much as possible.
Yeah, you also want to show that it has flexibility, like that you can, sometimes designers or communications folks will be like, oh, we have to use the guidelines or something like that. And to show that there's flexibility in it and still, and that it still creates this overall sensibility of your branding is where you'll really get that adoption and that idea of like, oh, I can kind of bring my own ideas to the brand and not fall outside of the branding.
Right. Okay. These are two kind of big questions, but I'm going to ask you to answer them in like a minute. But I'm going to give you one. You can choose which one you want to answer. The other one will answer in the written form. So how do you roll out a new brand? Or how do you come up with the research to come to the decision to change the brand? Which one of those do you want to tackle?
Are you asking me or Michelle?
I'm asking you, Gardner.
Okay, let's do the rollout one because the second one seems really hard to answer off the top of my head.
Okay.
We touched on it earlier, but that early checking in is so critical. So it's basically a very long runway that you're creating. And everyone is in the plane during the entire length of the runway, and then you will take off. So people don't just magically appear in the plane once it's in the air. So you want to make sure that everyone goes through all the processes of how this is going to come together, when you should expect it, the things that might be affected, et cetera, et cetera. And then once you've done all that kind of prep work, you want to try to make it fun and exciting and build some kind of anticipation around this. And so for Michelle's case in particular, again, given the budgets that you have and the scope of your audience, the channels that you have available to you, we chose to do some kind of more social media focused engagement using Facebook, to do some kind of town halls. We put together an entire launch plan for Michelle that she could follow, almost like a playbook, to say, okay, at this point we do this, and then 2 weeks later we do this, a month later we do this, we check in with the team here. So basically there's a lot of structure behind it. There's a lot of runway that you need to make sure you're there for. And again, the chapter thing here is a big piece of this, where you want to give them the runway they need to feel like they're ready to go live with the rest of the organization. Michelle, did you want to add anything to that?
No, that playbook was absolutely critical, and we followed it as much as and closely as possible. And we ended up launching with because we couldn't travel anybody. It was last September because of COVID and whatnot. And we also we were worried about the optics of traveling people, even if they were willing to do it. It's when you work in healthcare, that's a big deal. And so I think that the Facebook Live was hugely popular. We had a lot of live people then watched it. That video has gotten thousands of views at this point. So it was key. The rollout plan was spectacular.
I can't speak enough to a launch plan. I can't speak enough about it. Quit creating wonderful things and then not telling your people how to use it or or what it means. So it is time to wrap up today. I cannot thank the attendees enough for joining. Certainly, I really owe you speakers so much for being with us and subject matter experts. I love being with you always, but I'm really glad that we could speak on this together. And if you have any questions about what we're doing today, or if there's something else that Mighty Citizen can help you with, please email us at hello@mightycitizen.com. I also put my LinkedIn in the invite or in the chat earlier today. We're happy to connect. We thank you so much for joining us, and we really hope you have a great rest of the week. Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.